Chapter 5. Rapture. Hail Shaitan. What did you do? Overlapping repulsor fields from the fleet of tugs holding station overhead were interfering with the operation of Ahriman's warplate. He vented air from his gorget, easing the pressure within his helmet. 40 of the heavy-duty tugs, each little more than a servitor cockpit bolted to a vastly powerful gravitic engine, strained like hounds on the leash, poised to haul the Lux Ferrum's magnificent bulk into the air once its cargo bays were fully loaded. Once the mass conveyor's own engines could bear its colossal weight, they would detach and return to the spaceport. Enormous ramps led from the ground to the Lux Ferrum's cavernous embarkation decks, and thousands of people marched into its belly with their heads down. They bore all their worldly possessions on their backs, and every one of them turned for a last fleeting look at their doomed homeworld. "This is the last batch for loading," said Forix, consulting a data slate filled with names and numbers. "The balance sheet of survival," said Ahriman. "Those who will live to tell fond remembrances of their lost planet in the decades to come." "They are the lucky ones," said Forix. "They have fallen on the correct side of the equation and will get to live." Casting his senses out over the refugees being guided up the ramps like livestock, Ahriman doubted any of them felt lucky, but refrained from pointing that out. "It all comes down to numbers with the Fourth, doesn't it?" "Of course," said Forix. "Any fool knows that is how wars are won, through superior logistics, planning, and the proper assessment of risk." "What of courage? What of honor and sacrifice? Do they not also play a part in winning wars?" "Some," allowed Forix, "but far less than you would imagine. The greatest warrior of a legion cannot shoot if his bolter is without ammunition. The deadliest super-heavy tank cannot crush the enemy beneath its tracks without oceans of fuel, and the heaviest artillery cannot pound fortifications without a constant supply of shells. The duty of an Iron Warrior is to win any war as quickly and efficiently as possible." "I know you are correct, but to reduce war to numbers and equations feels like a mistake," said Ahriman. "When individual lives are no more than numbers, it becomes easier to forget that they are living beings. Yes, plan a war in this way, but do not fight it like that." "You are sentimental, Azek," said Forix, his words coming out like a warning. "So I hope you never have to face an enemy that thinks like my legion. It would not go well for you." Ahriman recoiled at the idea of taking arms against brother legionaries. That Forix could even consider such a thing spoke volumes as to his legion's outlook. What manner of debates must go on in the sanctums of the Iron Warriors? He put aside abhorrent thoughts of war between brothers, trying not to let the disturbing logic of Forix's words take hold in his heart. The refugees filed past, and he saw the same carved-in numbness on every face. "A pall of defeat hangs over them," he said. "Understandable," answered Forix. "There are more reports of random attacks in the streets. Violence is on the increase beyond the city limits and on the transit routes." "Is there no more we can do to keep these people safe?" "There is, but at what cost?" "Surely no cost is too high." "You forget we are against a ticking clock, Azek," pointed out Forix. "Too much security at the city perimeter means fewer people escape Morningstar, whereas no security gets more people to the ships quicker, but increases the risk of hostile infiltration. Lord Perturabo has calculated the optimal balance between speed of entry and the risk of allowing hostiles through the outer cordons. This is it." Ahriman knew Forix was correct, yet he could not help but rail against the notion of an individual's survival being a matter of unfeeling calculations. The members of the nascent Order of Ruin within the Thousand Suns were also fascinated with numbers, but their interest leaned more towards cosmological significance. This was different. This was the end result of a cold, logical, brute force arithmetic of death. "But you could speed this process, couldn't you?" said Forix. and Ahriman needed no psychic powers to know what the Iron Warrior was going to say next. "Your legion's abilities? You could employ them to look into these people's minds and identify those with hostile intent." Ahriman shook his head. "You have no idea of the complexity of what you are suggesting." "I've seen you do it already. Right before that madman's host attacked the crowds on the Boulevard of Firmaments." "That was different." "How so?" "He was one mind among many, his emotions monstrously heightened, and his thoughts like a beacon on a clear night." "Are you saying you cannot do it?" "No, only that such a feat is not as easy as you imagine." "But you can do it?" "Yes." "Show me," said Forix, nodding towards the refugees. Ahriman saw he wasn't going to escape without a demonstration of his powers, as if they were some kind of parlour trick instead of the result of years of study and training. "Very well," he said, easing his mind into the enumerations. He had not been entirely honest with Forix. What he was attempting was simple enough, but the Thousand Suns were yet to reveal the full extent of what they could do. Fear of the unknown was an all-too-human characteristic, even among the legions, and Magnus had yet to decide how and when such a revelation would be made. Ahriman slowed his breathing and allowed the confused, tangled morass of mortal thoughts to wash over him. A yammering tide of internal monologues broke like a surge tide against his mental defences. It was easy enough to withstand. Mortal thoughts were like the yapping of an irritating animal, full of basic wants and needs, and devoid of the clarity that only Prospero's teachings could instill. Forix's mind stood out like an inviolable rock in a tempestuous ocean, untouched and impermeable. Ahriman resisted the temptation to brush the Iron Warrior's mind, already knowing what he would see: hard-edged purpose and certainty, unbending devotion to duty, and a slavish obedience to his Primarch. "Blessed is the mind too small for doubt," thought Ahriman. The sentiment was unworthy of him. Forix was a warrior of great honour and courage, a legionary whom he would be proud to have at his side when the fires of the last great battle were closing in. And more than that, Ahriman suspected he and Forix were becoming friends, which had surprised him, until he thought of Magnus and Perturabo's friendship. Were they subconsciously emulating their gene-sires? Did a Primarch's behaviour have so profound an impact on his sons that they unwittingly aped it? Taking that thought to its furthest logical extreme offered some intriguing prospects for moral debate. If a Primarch was to exhibit morally questionable behaviour, would some of his sons blindly follow him? Would all of them? Would Ahriman? As if that thought were a key to some infernal lock of the future, Ahriman's neck snapped back, and he looked to the sky in horror as his corvidized senses flared. An agonizing veil of red fell over his sight, a bloody eclipse of things yet to be. Flames burned from here to the horizon, a world ablaze. Figures writhed in the firelight, legionaries in the livery of the Iron Warriors, impossibly alive and in endless torment. He saw Forix, his skin blackened and flesh running like wax as a torrent of impacts tore him apart, screaming in an agony that would never end. The vast Cyclopean bulk of something impossible to comprehend loomed over its burning empire, the sound of its laughter screeching, cruel and inhuman. Metal glinted in the sky from 1,000 falling blades, liquid fire rained down in a deluge, and mountains ran molten beneath it. The world tilted as if at some immense impact, a hammer of the gods slamming down. The impact threw Ahriman from his vision, and he cried out as a hideous sensation of vertigo blurred his vision. He felt himself falling until Forix caught him and lowered him to his knees. The Iron Warrior's aura blazed with readiness to fight. "What did you see?" demanded Forix. "Is there an imminent threat?" Ahriman tried to answer, but the horror of the destruction he had witnessed rendered him mute. It made him want to weep, to tear his hair and curse the stupidity of man. "I saw you die. I saw this place destroyed," he said, steadying himself with a palm flat on the ground. "Destroyed how?" "I do not know," said Araman, fighting to slow his racing heartbeat. "But it was no vision of natural catastrophe. It was an engineered doom." "Engineered? You mean an attack?" Araman nodded, blinking as he looked up, and the world-consuming fires of his ether vision faded. The natural streetscape and the slow-moving columns of refugees swam back into focus. "What I saw, it was an apocalypse of man's own devising." "When will this apocalypse happen?" "Soon." "Soon? When, exactly?" demanded Forix, his legion's hatred of ambiguity shining through in his bellicose aura. "I cannot say exactly," snapped Araman. He heard the click of Forix opening the vox to his fellow legionaries, and reached up to grip the Iron Warrior's arm. "Wait! The men who brought the fire," he said. "I sensed their minds. They were not filled with hate. Not at all." "Then what? Madness?" Araman felt the frightened stares of curious onlookers, and sensed their unease at the sight of a fallen legionary. Which of them would it be? "Of a sort," he said, rising unsteadily to his feet, mentally reciting the Mandalic catechism to centre himself.
"What do you mean?"
asked Forix. "It was love," said Araman. "It was rapture." The las cannon blast struck Magnus just below his heart. His surprise was total. He had no time to raise a kind shield. Pain ripped through him. The beam burned with the heat of a sun. A stinking mist of instantly vaporized blood and tissue enveloped him. He inhaled a draught of red mist, an aerosolized breath of his own body. Magnus had never been hurt before. Not truly. He had allowed himself to suffer cuts and bruises when it suited his purposes to allow his sons to see him bleed alongside them, but nothing like this. He had even suffered more severe wounds to better understand the experience, but that had been entirely controlled. Only as the superheated beam destroyed his flesh did he fully appreciate how cowardly that had been. He dropped Conrad Varga as the supplicants surrounding him scattered in screaming panic. High-caliber shells from sponson-mounted assault weapons raked them, cutting down a score of people almost immediately and wounding dozens more. The Red Dragons were slaughtering their own people. Anger gave Magnus focus, and he drew a kind shield about him as easily as a mortal man might pull a cloak tighter in a cold wind. The second las cannon shot bent around him like light through water. He ripped the weapon from its sponson mount with a flick of thought. Fire erupted from the Bane Blade's flank as arcing lightning flared from ruptured power lines. Magnus felt the elation of the mind at the gunner's position behind the super-heavy tank's prow-mounted cannon. His arm pistoned out as its shortened barrel blazed with fire and smoke. The siege shell was moving at 1,500 meters per second, but Magnus swept his arm to the side and the shell slammed into the foundry wall behind him. It detonated in a devastating blast, and the already weakened walls of the ruined structure came down in a roaring cascade of debris. Magnus heard screams as people taking shelter from the rogue vehicles were crushed by falling masonry. He threw kind shields over as many as he could, but it wasn't enough to save them all. The ground heaved as an aftershock rumbled far below the surface, toppling what few structures were left standing. Magnus took that power and drew it into himself, grunting as the world's pain suffused his flesh. He thrust his hand forwards, and an up-armoured rhino crumpled as though in the grip of an invisible titan. Metal shrieked and spat fire as the vehicle's entire mass was compacted down to a perfect sphere, no more than a metre in diameter. Magnus clenched his fist and swung his arm to the side, slamming the unimaginably dense mass of metal like a wrecking ball. He smashed another rhino flat before hammering the wreckage into a pair of chimeras. The vehicles hurtled through the air, vanishing over the cliffs of the sea docks. More lasbolts and solid slugs raked him. Most skidded away from his psi shield, but others clipped his armour, grazed his flesh, or in one case, exploded against his ribs. Magnus fell to one knee, his protection dissolving into scraps of hard air. Another shot took him high on the shoulder, spinning him around and almost knocking him onto his back. Iridescent blood sheeted his armour, the metal reshaping itself around the wound. The executioner swerved around the wrecks of its fellows, looking to flank him. Its turret cannons swung around as its hull weapons fired into the sheltering civilians. The Baneblade came straight at him. It ground over the smashed remains of a headless statue, crushing the likeness of an imperial grandee to powder beneath its titanic weight. The turret-mounted battle cannon lowered, and Magnus sensed the crew within. The driver alight with manic glee, the commander exhilarated at the prospect of slaying so mighty a foe, its gunners vying for the chance to take the kill shot. Their auras blazed with the passions common to all mortals in the crucible of combat. Magnus rammed his power into their skulls, tearing at the myriad webs of synaptic connections within. They screamed in his mind as he twisted their thoughts like a team of riggers hauling on a mainsail, making them his puppets. The Baneblade swung about and slammed into the flanking executioner, crumpling its red-painted hull and driving it up onto one track. The tank tipped over, and the Baneblade punched it forwards 20 metres until finally driving it hard against a wall of debris. The super-heavy tank's tracks ripped up rock and dust as the driver gunned the engines. Reeking smoke belched from its protesting drive unit. Magnus sent a pulse of thought to the Baneblade's gunners, and both tanks vanished in a series of percussive fireballs as they fired every weapon system. The executioner was obliterated instantly, and the force of the point-blank blasts ripped open the Baneblade's glacis. It rolled back from the carnage, its front armour peeled open, with thick black smoke belching from within. Screaming bodies tumbled from the flames. Magnus let them burn. He saw the outline of the last tank through the smoke and fire of the Baneblade's death. He expected it to retreat, to flee the destruction, but instead it roared towards him, spraying mass-reactive rounds from its cupola mount. Magnus turned them to wisps of perfumed air and lifted the tank from the ground with an outstretched hand. The tracks spun, and the fusillade of gunfire continued. Magnus stood immobile before a wall of burning tanks, surrounded by the dead and the dying. The insanity of the last moments filled his mind with a fury like nothing he had ever known. He pulled the tank apart, every rivet unmoored, every screw unthreaded, every welded seam undone. Nothing was destroyed or damaged, and with enough time and patience a tech marine could have rebuilt the tank. At the heart of the disassembled vehicle, the tank's crewmen drifted like a pair of spacefarers adrift in zero gravity. The gunner reached for his sidearm. Magnus increased his core temperature by 1,000 degrees between heartbeats. The man exploded in a flash of superheated, blood-rich vapour. He pulled the driver of the vehicle towards him, bolts and washers spinning away as his flailing arms tried to resist the inexorable force reeling him in. He held the man before him in the air and ripped his helmet off with a thought. The face before him was ordinary, but what had he expected to see? The face of a monster? Someone who could be seen to be evil for what he had done? No, this was simply a man. His skin had the pallid, oily sheen common to tankers, but Magnus saw none of the awe and dread common to mortals when they first laid eyes on him. Even Rebute and Rogel, Primarchs of a comprehensible nature to mortal sensibilities, still elicited wonder.
"Finish me!"
he screamed.
"I must die!"
"You will die," promised Magnus. "But first you are going to tell me why you were trying to kill the planetary governor." The man laughed, his system thick with intoxicants, his mind afire with burning certainty.
"The great dying is upon us,"
he said, the words pouring out of him in a rush.
"The end of days is to be welcomed, not feared. You and your devil warriors are keeping us from the rapture we were promised when the night of nights fell upon the galaxy. The chosen people were lifted up, but our world endured. We were kept from our rightful place at the side of the Stormlord. We have kept to the faith, and this is our time, as was foretold in the Book of Leviathan. We will die in the fire as morning star falls, and we will be reborn. So it was written, so shall it be. Hail, Shaitan!"
Now Magnus understood the man's lack of awe. This was no confessional. It was the preaching of a zealot. His sense of wonder was already invested in a power beyond the reach of measure or accountability. an invented power that could never be called into question because it could never be seen or touched. Blind faith was his armour against any doubt. "I came here to save you people," said Magnus.
"We do not need saving," spat the man. "We do not want saving. You are a devil, one of the fallen angels, and the Stormlord's retribution will be mighty when his fire turns on you and your faithless sons."
"I almost feel sorry for you," said Magnus. "You have been fed banal lies and told it was golden truth."
"No, for I have seen the truth. When death takes me, I will be numbered among the blessed."
"You think death will be your salvation?"
"I know it will be."
"Then I'm doing you a favour," said Magnus, and snapped the man's neck. He dropped the corpse and let the suspended parts of the rhino fall to the ground. They clattered to the ruins in a rain of glittering metal as the few survivors of the treacherous attack emerged in ones and twos from the flaming rubble. Magnus ignored them, too focused on trying to restore his etheric balance. The power of the world he had taken into his body was still there, its vast and awesome potential like pressure building behind a cracking dam. With such power, he could achieve almost anything, and the temptation to wield it was almost too great to resist. For what craven heart could feel and see infinity, then turn from it? He took in a furnace-hot breath, letting the pain, anger, frustration, and the savage pleasure he had taken in the act of murder settle within his flesh. This borrowed power would likely destroy him without the proper ritual cleansing to allow it to dissipate back into the warp. No, the repercussions of this day would not easily fade. The survivors of Attar flowed around Magnus like water around a rock. They bent to retrieve Conrad Varga and bore him between them like a fallen martyr. The man groaned in his unconsciousness, kept from agony by Magnus's Pavoni arts. Magnus exhaled slowly, letting his senses spread over the city once more. He felt the presences of his legionaries, already working their way back to the Stormbirds with as many other survivors as they could rescue.
"My lord!"
Phocis Takar sensed his master's damaged presence, and was instantly aware that something singular and profound had occurred.
"Are you hurt?"
"Not in any way that matters. Ready the gunships. We are leaving this city."
"Do you have the planetary governor?"
"I do," said Magnus.
"Is he alive?"
"He is," said Magnus. "Fix on my location. I have other survivors."
"Yes, my lord, on our way."
Magnus felt Phocis Takar's confusion. The warrior had been told that his Primarch was all but a god, immortal and undying, a wise and noble exemplar of all that was good in humanity. Now he knew different. So too did Magnus.
"Do we open it?"
asked Hathor Mart. It seemed like a foolish question, but Atharva had no readily available answer. Of course he wanted to open it, but should he? In time the hatch would undoubtedly be opened, but the more pertinent question was, should they open it now? "We should wait," he said at last. "Bring in specialized cutting equipment, stasis capsules, hermetic vault chests, and pressure suits. We can have no contamination of the site." He sensed Hathor Mart's impatience and looked back up the shaft. Nico Ashkali's head and shoulders were silhouetted in a square of light high above. The magnastorm and seismic activity had made the stairs bolted to the walls of the shaft too dangerous to use. So, much to her chagrin, she was forced to watch the thousand suns drop down until the safety of what lay below could be established.
"Wait,"
said Hathor Mart.
"In case you hadn't noticed, this planet is on a countdown to extinction."
"I know that. But if we are reckless, we risk losing everything this ship may teach us of Morningstar's past."
"And if we hesitate, we could lose it anyway. It's calm just now, but who knows how long that will last? Come on, Atharva, we have to open it."
"Do not pretend your desire to open this is in service of future posterity," said Atharva. "You just want to be the first to uncover what lies within."
"Don't you?"
Atharva had to admit he was tempted to give way before Hathor Mart's insistence. To be the discoverer of a relic from before Old Night, from the golden age of exploration itself, would be a great honor. A distant tremor rocked the ground. Dust and steel pipework fell into the shaft. "Come on, Athava," said Hathomat. "Who knows how long this place will last? We have to go in." Though he was loath to proceed without the proper protocols and equipment in place, Athava knew they had no choice. "Very well," he said at last. "We will open it." They both took hold of the locking bar, its metal smooth and cold to the touch. The edges of the hatch had been welded shut, the line of the seam ragged and uneven, as though done in great haste. Athava flexed his fingers on the bar, an artifact that had been forged thousands of years ago by men who knew nothing of the great expansion their efforts would precede. A moment such as this ought to be savoured. "Ready?" said Hathomat. "I am," replied Athava, and despite his dislike of the legionary, he was elated like a neophyte on his first excavation. "Pull!" said Hathomat. They hauled the locking bar, and legionary strength and psychic power vied with the resistance of the welded seam in a one-sided battle. Athava's pyre focus weakened the fusion bonds of the weld, as Hathomat altered his biochemistry and muscle density to exert greater power. The seam gave way moments later, cracking where the locking bolts would sit. A sulphurous breath of pressurized air vented from the opening as they swung the hatch wide on protesting hinges. A groaning sound, as of ancient metal settling, echoed from deep within the starship. "I am a fool," said Athava, instantly wary. "This is no relic, and this is no excavation site." "What do you mean?" He pointed to the exposed lock mechanisms of the hatch. "Someone was in a great hurry to seal this hatch behind them. Why? The air inside is under pressure, which means this place still has power." "Why would someone do that?" said Hathomat. "I do not know," said Athava, "but let us think logically. The presence of this shaft in the structure overhead tells me that someone discovered this ship long ago. They must have already explored it. But why seal the hatch? Maybe they finished their exploration. Even so, why weld the hatch shut? Contamination? Perhaps. But it is probably safe to assume that any pathogens within will be long dead." Hathomat laughed, picking up on Athava's enthusiasm for exploration. "You want to go in as much as I do, don't you?" "Yes," admitted Athava. "Well, now we definitely need to get inside." Chapter 6. Leviathan Rises. Idle Hands. Hammer of the Gods. Tensions were high in Kalena's orbital command center. The moment Vashti had been planning for the last 6 days had finally arrived. She chewed the inside of her mouth, glanding a mixture of stims and mood stabilizers almost non-stop, as the plates of the windows vibrated with powerful gravitic waves from the landing fields. "Come on, come on, come on," she muttered under her breath for the 10th time in the last 2 minutes. "Lift, damn you! Lift!" The monster of steel that was the subject of her imprecations sat in a haze of distortion, making it difficult to see whether or not her words were having any effect. "A little respect might help," offered Majos Rom from the center of her entoptic sphere of data light. "The machine knows all. The machine hears all." "Fine," snapped Vashti. "Lift, damn you, lift, please!" "Not quite what I had in mind, but it will have to do." "It's all I've got, Tezza," said Vashti. Her every nerve and sinew was bowstring taut. All of her staff were fixated on their data slates, watching for signs of trouble in the launch. Tens of thousands of vital elements needed to go right for the Lux Ferrum to get off the ground, and only one had to go wrong for the launch to fail. Then it happened. The ship and the ground parted company. The console nearest her chirruped, indicating sufficient height had been gained to engage the platform repulsors. "Yes," said Vashti. "Kick the platforms to -4G, increasing to 10G in 20-second increments." She glanced over at the tension ratio in the tug cables. "Increase thrust on the tug's 4 points. They need to lift smooth as glass or they'll tear loose." Yes, Commander, said Corinna Moreno, transmitting the order from her station by flicking a series of mother-of-pearl switches. Order sent. Airspace clear? Clear, answered Moreno, and an exhausted cheer went up. Hands were shaken, backs were slapped, and tearful embraces given. Vashti smiled, and her chin sank to her chest as she let out a relieved breath. She wiped the back of her hand over her forehead. Right, people, she said. I want everyone to stay sharp. We're not done yet. This old girl's just stretched her wings, but we still need to see her all the way. The chatter died down a little, and Vashti walked to the edge of the command centre, peering down onto the platforms through the vibrating armour glass. No matter how many times she laid eyes on it, the colossal scale of the Lux Ferrum still defied comprehension. The hard vacuum of the void was this vessel's natural home, not the crushing gravity of a planet. Though she knew it was possible, and, according to her command centre's instruments, was actually happening, common sense told Vashti it should be impossible for something of such inhuman scale to achieve escape velocity. And yet it had. She could see it right in front of her. Vashti laughed in delight and hammered a fist on the glass. Yes, damn it! You're actually flying, you beautiful girl! A shadow was forming beneath the colossal starship, a black footprint on Morningstar's surface, with radiating lines from the tug fleet helping to drag the ship's unimaginable mass into the sky. Under normal circumstances, the Lux Ferrum's engines would be fully capable of lifting it into orbit, but with every hold packed to the gunwales with evacuees and supplies to keep them alive, the old girl needed a little help. Vashti's eyes drifted from the rising Leviathan to the hordes of frightened people still waiting behind lines of demarcation and strategically deployed groups of space marines. An augmetic implant in her right eye did a swift calculation, based on how many people they'd managed to get away and how many remained. She factored in projected loading times, number of civilian ships available, and the Majos Geologicus's best estimate of the time Morningstar had left. She came up short, and her delight at the Lux Ferrum's imminent departure evaporated. She didn't have enough ships to carry everyone to safety. So many people are going to be left behind, she said. She remembered the briefing, where the grim-faced Titan who led the Iron Warriors had spoken of the unavoidable loss of life the evacuation would incur. He spoke as if people were simply statistics. But by the end of his briefing, even through his stoically logical facade, she felt his genuine regret. Vashti told herself she could deal with it. They couldn't save everyone. Saving some was better than saving none. But seeing just how many would never escape Morningstar, she wasn't sure she could ever forgive herself for leaving them to die. Could anyone? The heavily laden Stormbird followed the coast northwards towards Kalena, keeping beneath clashing atmospherics that more and more were sounding like screaming. Morningstar was entering its last days, and howled its pain on the wind. Magnus tried to shut it out, but even with his eye closed and his senses blunted, he could still hear the psychic echoes of the world's doom. His flesh shimmered with heat as the alchemy wrought by the Emperor's gene rites worked miracles within his flesh to renew him. The damage was extensive, more than he had ever suffered before, so he tried to hang on to how it felt. More than that, he still carried the immense power he had drawn from Morningstar's volatile heart. It simmered just beneath his skin, potent and seething with the desire to be unleashed. He kept it locked within, chained like suppressed rage or a buried secret. Such power needed to be released slowly, like a deep-sea diver decompressing on his way to the surface. The process would be painful, agonizingly so. But Magnus had borne worse before and endured. Teeth gritted against the repercussive pain filling his bones with broken glass, he let his gaze roam the Stormbird's interior. 100 or more bloodied survivors pulled from the wreckage of Attar, packed the troop compartment alongside weary, dust-covered legionaries. Mortal and transhuman sat side by side on bulkhead benches, or slumped upon the swaying deck plates, their auras sapped of vitality. His warriors had driven themselves to the very edge of their abilities in Attar, employing every aspect to save as many of its people as they could. Every one of them would be changed by what they had seen and done. Magnus had never been more proud of his sons than now. To see such devastation and to take in such innocence lost was difficult for all of them, Magnus especially. His sons were suffering, and he could not help them. Not this time. Helplessness was anathema to him. When he had last felt this way, he had made a decision he always knew might haunt him in years to come. Today was not that day, but seeing his sons bloodied and all but broken sent a tremor of unease through his furnace-hot body. He opened his eye as the sound of roaring engines screamed past the Stormbird. From the tone and pitch, he identified Promethean-based ramjets, most likely a Primaris Thunderbolt fighter squadron. An escort for the governor, perhaps, or additional protection dispatched by Perturabo. Neither, it seemed, for the jets roared onwards to Kalena. Magnus glanced towards the rear of the Stormbird's troop compartment, where Conrad Varga was being treated. The man was weeping and incoherent with pain. His legs were extensively damaged, but thanks to Magnus's intervention, he would likely keep them. The governor's survival was miraculous, and while it had been brave of him to venture out into Attar, his duty was in Kalena, putting a human face on the sacrifices necessary to save as many of Morningstar's inhabitants as possible. But Magnus could not fault a leader willing to dirty his hands in order to save those he loved. Ahriman barged through the crowds, pushing his senses into the throng of refugees. He had not the time for simply skimming thoughts. Instead, he punched through the flimsy mental barriers mortals wove around their minds, which they believed impervious. Everyone who met his gaze fell back, crying out as he tore into their thoughts for signs of the treachery he had seen. Men and women dropped to their knees, screaming and clutching their skulls in pain. Who will it be? From where will they strike? He pushed deep into the crowds, scattering them like herd animals with an apex predator in their midst. He spread his psychic net wide, seeking one path among millions that might lead to the vision he had seen, a fleeting trace of future echoes in the thoughts of tens of thousands. "Where are you?" he muttered. Forix followed him through the crowds, Bolter ready to take out any threat the instant it was revealed to him. "Anything?" he demanded. "Give me a target." "I don't have one." "Find one." "One mind among so many," said Ahriman, taking deep breaths, but trying to calm himself in the face of such desperation was all but impossible. "It will not be one mind," said Forix. "What?" "What you saw. It will not be one mind. It will be many." "How can you know that?" said Ahriman, turning on the spot. "What you described was too devastating and too complex for one person. There will be others helping whoever is going to do this. Seek connections, and you will find them." Ahriman took a calming breath, using the cantrips of the lower enumerations to balance his humours. Forix was right. An operation of this magnitude would take numerous individuals to execute, with many moving parts and traitors within the very institutions set up to protect these civilians. The scale of such treachery was hard to fathom. He nodded and curled his fingertips together, one palm above the other. "Seek not the psyche, he said. "Follow the threads of its mind web, and you will be led to the host." "What's that?" "An old cautionary tale of Prospero," said Ahriman, turning to face Forix. He put a hand on the Iron Warrior's shoulder guard and looked him square in the eye. "I need you to watch over me, Forix," he said. "What do you mean?" "To do what I need to do, I need to detach an element of my psychic awareness. My consciousness will be elsewhere. That will leave my body vulnerable. So I ask that you protect it." "I don't know exactly what that means, but I swear no harm will come to you while I watch over you," promised Forix. "Thank you, my friend," said Ahriman. "You honor me." "Go," said Forix. "Find them and stop them." Ahriman nodded, then let slip the bindings of flesh and soared into the sky. Perhaps 100 meters of clear air separated the Lux Ferrum from the ground. Vashti was trying not to hold her breath as it climbed. Every meter from the surface was a victory that saw every life aboard it closer to safety. Its vast bulk shivered like a newborn taking its first steps. The glowing repulsor plates on its belly were hazed with building energy. "Altitude?" she asked, unable to take her eyes from the struggling vessel. 160 meters, said Corinna Moreno. "Rising at a rate of 10 meters a second." "Come on," said Vashti, chewing her bottom lip and running the numbers in her head. Tezza Rom beat her to it. "The Lux Ferrum needs at least 500 meters of clear air before she can safely engage her ventral repulsors," said Majos Rom. "I know that, Tezza," said Vashti. "And even that is much lower than I would recommend." 200 meters, said Moreno. "High enough." Before Vashti could correct Moreno, the noospheric globe of light around Tezza Rom flickered an ugly red as 8 unauthorized contacts entered her tightly controlled airspace. "Who the hell?" Vashti said, turning her attention to the icons flickering to life at the edge of her panel. "Fast movers," said Rom, "coming in from the south. Transponders identify them as a Primarchs squadron. Thunderbolts previously based in Atar." "What the hell are they doing here?" swore Vashti. "I don't have space for a drop pod, let alone a whole squadron of cocksure aviators. Vox the squadron lead and tell him to get out of my airspace." "I am trying," said Tezza, data lights swirling around her station. "No reply." "Throne! Are they blind or just stupid?" said Vashti. "Atar might be gone, but I don't have space to land a jet bike here." She snatched up the Voxhorn and dialed into the frequency displayed on the transponder readouts. "Primaris lead, be advised you are entering a highly volatile, controlled airspace," she said, struggling to remain calm, even as she watched the icons of the fighters drawing closer. "Alter your heading immediately. Do not approach the exclusion zone around Kalena Spaceport. You are not cleared to enter, and I am authorized to employ deadly force to keep my airspace just the way I want it." Static was her only answer. The thunderbolts kept coming, so she pressed the Vox switch again. "Thunderbolts Primaris, I say again, alter your heading immediately. A boundary line of 3 kilometers exists around this location. If you violate that, you will be fired upon. This is your final warning." The Vox crackled with connection static. "Finally," said Vashti. "Hail, Shaitan!" said Primaris lead. "What was that?" said Vashti. "Say again, Primaris lead." "He said, 'Hail, Shaitan!'" said Corinna Moreno, standing and disconnecting from her cogitator bank, as if leaving at the end of a work rotation. "What are you doing, Corinna?" said Vashti. "Link back into your station." Moreno did not answer. Instead, she spread wide her arms. Her porcelain-smooth augmetic limb unfolded with machine precision to reveal wads of tightly packed physaline. In her other hand, she held a detonator. "Corinne, what—" began Vashti. "Hail, Shaitan!" said Moreno, pressing the detonator's trigger. In a blazing explosion of white fire and fury, Kalena's orbital command center went dark. Forix had no clear idea what to expect, but he knew the exact moment Ahriman's presence left his body. The legionary of the 1,000 Suns went stiff, his muscles locking him in position. Panicked crowds milled in confusion, shrouded in the shadow of the mighty starship as it fought for altitude. The ordered columns in which they had been made to march through the city were broken, and frightened faces looked to him for direction. "Get down on your knees," said Forix, knowing that keeping people static was likely the best option for now. "And stay down until an Iron Warrior tells you to get back up." Those people nearest to him complied instantly. The rest followed suit in concentric waves, making Forix feel like he stood at the epicenter of their devotion. The notion briefly amused him, until the ever-widening circle of kneeling refugees revealed an approaching column of army vehicles that had no business being this close to the loading zones. 4 Praetors and 2 Hydra flak tanks. The presence of such armoured vehicles within the precincts of a spaceport was entirely normal. Each was specifically designed to engage aerial enemies. But such mobile artillery was usually deployed towards the perimeter of a defended zone. The anti-aircraft tanks ground to a halt, and Forrex's unease grew as he watched their crews begin bracing protocols, in readiness to fire. He looked at Ahriman's immobile body. Could the legionary be lifted, or would that break whatever trance he was in? Forrex had no way of knowing, but bent to sling Ahriman onto his shoulder. The warrior was a dead weight across him, loose-limbed like a casualty. Forrex set off at a jog through the kneeling multitudes towards the tanks. He held Ahriman tight over one shoulder, his bolter held low beside his leg. The soldiers working on the tanks saw him coming, and their reaction told Forrex everything he needed to know about their intent. "Legionary Forrex to all Iron Warrior units! Enemy in the wire! I repeat, enemy in the wire! Until further notice, treat all local Red Dragon and Army forces as enemy combatants!" He couldn't know for sure that every Morning Star soldier was hostile, but the Iron Warriors operated a zero uncertainty policy within their perimeters. "Enemy anti-aircraft units are in position to attack the Lux Ferrum. Heavy support to my location immediately." A Praetor tank slowly turned on grinding tracks, bringing its heavy bolters to bear. Its crew formed a disciplined fire line. Battle protocols. Think and move. A flurry of lasbolts slashed towards Forrex. Paltry impacts blistered his armour. He ignored them. His Mark IV plate had been forged to withstand the worst the galaxy could throw at him. A few shots hit Ahriman. More flayed the kneeling refugees. They screamed in terror and pressed themselves flat to the ground. Others died as they fled, cut down without mercy by the indiscriminate fire. His anger built, inferno hot. "Use it! Direct it!" Forrex raised his bolter, targeting reticules centered on 5 soldiers. 5 dead men. He fired one-handed, squeezing the trigger in smooth intervals. Gen-enhanced flesh worked with his armor's servo-assisted muscles to dissipate recoil. Mass-reactive bolts blasted every target to blossoming sprays of pulped flesh and blood. "Now they're run." But in defiance of all Forrex had learned of transhuman dread, the other soldiers rushed him. They fired from the hip, screaming obscenities as they charged. "You crave death?" he said. "I am happy to oblige." He fired a stream of shells, cutting his attackers down in a blitzing storm of bolter fire. Not one survived to reach him. "Keep moving. Find cover before those tanks engage." The unmistakable clatter of cycling autoloaders sounded. "Too late." Forrex dropped to one knee as the Praetor opened fire. "Heavy bolter, high-caliber mass reactives." Explosions ripped up the honeycombed structure of the landing platform in a line towards him, bolt shells chewing through screaming civilians. Plumes of metal-laced plascrete flew. Blood misted the air as bodies detonated. Forrex jinked right. 2 shells clipped his left shoulder. Another hit him dead center on his breastplate. The explosion rocked him back onto his haunches. "Find cover! Feel the iron within!" Forrex leaned into the fire, keeping his own bulk between the gunfire and Ahriman's supine body. Another 2 shells detonated against his shoulder guard. Warning icons bloomed to life on his visor. "Find cover!" Forrex surged to his feet and ran towards the largest concentration of bloodied bodies. He maglocked his bolter to his thigh and scooped up 4 limp corpses, holding them close as the tank's gunner fired another salvo. Shells ripped into his meat shields, and the bodies convulsed under the impacts, acting as ablatives to detonate the mass-reactive warheads before they struck him. Blood sheeted his warplate, and bone fragments lodged in the cracks in his ceramite. A Hydra tank moved into an enfilading position, its long-barreled guns slowly rising to their engagement angle. Burdened as he was, Forrex knew he wouldn't reach the Hydra before its guns opened up. He made another quarter turn to shield Ahriman from the incoming fire as its cupola-mounted heavy stubber opened fire. Its shells raked him, shredding what remained of the corpses and pounding his armor. His warplate cracked and split at the weaker flex joints. Blood drizzled the spaces within his armor.
Forix staggered as a mass-reactive round shattered his left knee. A spike of white-hot pain shot through his leg, a shrapnel ricocheted down his shin bone and blew out his ankle. Pain suppressors flooded his system, numbing the flesh around his wound as adrenal stims surged. He kept going, feeling cracked bone grinding within the shredded meat of his foot. He roared and blasted the gunner from the turret mount of the Hydra. His visor was awash with target icons, spiking vitals and damage indicators. More shells followed him, but the angle was too sharp now for the gunners. A flurry of rockets streaked from the other praetors. "Oh, no!" yelled Forix, as they slashed towards the Lux Ferrum. Ahriman soared into the sky, a comet unleashed from its earthly prison. His subtle body blazed with light, all the potential of his being coalesced into a glittering shooting star that craved the heavens once more. The ground fell away, a terrestrial prison for corporeal form. The lightness of being was intoxicating, a sense of freedom beyond compare. As always, he fought the desire to never return to flesh, to exist in this perfect form of expression for all time. This was the trap of the subtle body, a rush of sensation that some neophytes failed to master. They would soar on psychic zephyrs, freed from the banal necessities of existence and heedless of their body's disintegration. Only its eventual death severed the silver cord and dissipated their essence. Ahriman flew in a curving arc around the gargantuan form of the Lux Ferrum. Its structure was barely visible as a shadowed skeleton, like a vast void-swimming colossus whose belly was filled with wriggling prey. Tens of thousands of souls glimmered within the ship, frightened souls, grateful souls, spiteful souls, and every other emotion running the gamut of human experience. But chief among the emotions he felt was hope. Humanity's greatest virtue and its greatest weakness. The heavy gravitic tugs were smudges of blunted emotion, cauterized wells of life without thoughts or feelings. The frontal lobes of their servitor pilots had been burned out, and Ahriman was revolted by such crude surgeries. A ferocious spike of emotion drew his attention from the tugs, and he arced over in time to see the tower of the spaceport's orbital command center vanish in a sheeting fireball. He felt echoes of horror, anger, and righteous zeal bloom from the detonation. Rapture. Forix was correct. Betrayals of this magnitude stretched beyond lone madmen or a few crazed adherents of a suppressed cult. This treachery ran deep. Ahriman flinched as he felt a surge of that same rapture he had experienced in his vision below. He rolled in the air, soaring over the back of the iron leviathan, struggling to reach the safety of the void, a journey that now seemed all but impossible. One of the lifter tugs exploded in a cherry-red fireball, the detonation of its gravitic engine sending out an expanding wave of force. Another followed swiftly, falling onto the back of the Lux Ferrum and smashing to pieces. Ahriman saw the source of the destruction. A flight of 8 Thunderbolt fighters streaked towards the mass conveyor with lethal intent. Streaks of fire blazed from underslung nose cannons, while white contrails followed sky-strike missiles as they leapt from wing pylons. 4 more tugs exploded, easy prey for the heavy fighters. The flight broke up, 4 peeling off to starboard, 4 to port. Guns chattering, they raked the flanks of the Lux Ferrum. Alternating punches of autocannon and las-cannon fire chewed up hull plates and tore away plasma thrusters and warp vanes. Ahriman followed the starboard flight down. He rammed his consciousness into the mind of the trailing pilot. He felt the man's exhilaration, his desire to bring death to the thousands of people aboard the Lux Ferrum. Ahriman vaporized his brain with a thought, and the aircraft dropped out of formation, spinning out of control to the ground. The remaining 3 craft scattered, believing they were under conventional attack. Ahriman stretched out his kind powers and slammed 2 aircraft together. They exploded as their unexpended ordnance detonated at the ferocious impact. The final aircraft spun in ever more desperate evasive maneuvers, its pilot trying in vain to pinpoint the source of his comrade's demise.
Araman swooped low over the back of the corkscrewing aircraft and thrust his consciousness into the pilot's mind. He pressed the man's screaming thoughts hard against the lid of his skull, knowing in an instant every aspect of commanding this aerial steed. He threw the plane into a steep climb, angling the winds to catch the thermals lifting off the back of the mass conveyor. A fierce exhilaration filled him, and he understood a measure of the arrogance he saw in the swagger of every aviator he had ever met. Like the cavalrymen of old Earth, the pilot of a combat aircraft was a god of the battlefield. Araman rolled the Thunderbolt around, seeing the other 4 fighters looping back around for another strafing run. The air above the vast starship was smudged with explosions and drifting smoke from the downed tugs. The wreckage of at least a dozen burned on the Lux Ferrum's dorsal surfaces. Another salvo of missiles leapt from the wing hardpoints of the attacking fighters. They raced towards their targets, but, at the last second, Araman twisted their course and turned them back upon their source. There was something the Emperor had said on the day of his departure from Prospero. It seemed appropriate now. The hawk always returns to the hand that loosed it. 2 thunderbolts exploded as their own missiles flew into their engine intakes. A third dropped out of the sky as Araman extended his powers and ripped its wings off like a child tormenting a trapped insect. The final aircraft turned into him, its prow guns blazing. Araman vacated the pilot's mind as a hurricane of autocannon rounds shredded his thunderbolt. The shockwave of its demise chased Araman, and his pyre powers ignited the air within the last thunderbolt's cockpit. He relished the pilot's agonized screams as he was burned alive in the raging firestorm within his aircraft. The fighter spun out and crashed in a tumbling fireball along the Lux Ferrum's upper surfaces. Araman twisted in the air, his subtle body resonating with the power of the great ocean and the impunity with which he had destroyed these men. He searched for other aircraft, almost wishing there were more. Then he saw it wouldn't matter. As fast as he had killed the attacking fighters, it hadn't been fast enough. More than half of the lifter tugs had been destroyed. The Lux Ferrum was going down. Forix roared in anger as yet more blossoming explosions marched along the belly of the mass conveyor. One of its repulsor generators blew out with a thunderous detonation. The shockwave buckled the air and drove anyone below who wasn't already there onto the ground. More explosions erupted on the mass conveyor's flanks, and shattered plating fell in a burning rain from the breached hull of the enormous vessel. An explosion mushroomed a few hundred meters away. Wreckage spun away from whatever had smashed into the ground. Forix saw a pair of raptor-winged interceptors streak overhead. One vanished in a tumbling fireball as the pursuing aircraft's guns blew out its engines. He didn't have time to wonder what was going on overhead.
"Get up! Keep moving! From iron cometh strength," said Forix through gritted teeth. "From strength cometh will."
Pushing past the agony of his shattered knee, he surged to his feet and limped towards the nearest Hydra. Every step brought pain, but he had to keep going. Another crewman climbed to the Hydra's cupola mount and threw his dead comrade from the vehicle. Forix blasted him from the vehicle's topside with a single shot. The slide racked back empty.
"No time to reload. From will cometh faith. From faith cometh honor."
Another salvo of missiles leapt from the Praetor's launchers, detonating moments later against the Lux Ferrum's hull. More wreckage tumbled downwards as the explosions blew out the bulkheads of cargo holds, and Forix saw flailing bodies tumbling from the ruptured starship. Even over the bellow of gunfire and the bone-shaking bass note of the Lux Ferrum's struggling repulsors, Forix heard their terrified screams. He reached the forward hull of the Hydra and bent his one good leg before pistoning upwards. He landed on the tank's topside. His ruined knee shrieked, and a veil of blinding agony fell across his vision. A crewman emerged from the cupola, holding a crackling Volkite caliver. Forix smashed his bolter down on the soldier's skull, crushing bone and helmet to shards.
"From honor cometh iron."
The Hydra's guns were angled up towards the Lux Ferrum. The turret rotated to the side. The two gunners looked around in surprise at the sight of this blood-soaked giant lumbering towards them. Their surprise did not last long. Forix killed both with sweeps of his bolter, using the weapon like a club. He kicked their bodies from the crew platform and laid Ahriman down as gently as possible against the rear handrail. A flurry of shots spanked from the blast shield around the wide barrels of the upraised autocannons. He ducked into cover as a searing hot beam of plasma exploded against the shield, turning its upper quadrant to molten slag. The workings of a Hydra were no mystery to Forix. An Iron Warrior could operate any artillery piece in the Imperial armory. He pressed himself into the contoured shoulder grips, squatting to fit his armoured bulk in a space designed for mortal frames. He stamped the pivot pedal and swung the quad-barreled weapon around as more gunfire impacted the hissing blast shield. Lasfire and plasma bolts, along with heavy slugs and missiles from bipod-mounted launchers. Red-hot fragments ricocheted around him, perforating his shoulder and neck. He ignored them and centered the Praetor on the Hydra's sights. "This is my unbreakable litany. May it forever be so," said Forix, squeezing the palm triggers. The Hydra bucked like a wild bullgrox. The noise was deafening, like the very fabric of the world being ripped asunder. All four barrels unleashed a blizzard of high-explosive shells into the nearest Praetor's flank. The vehicle vanished in a blinding fireball as the rockets inside cooked off in a series of booming detonations. But his triumph was short-lived, as he saw it had come too late, that Ahriman's apocalyptic vision was coming to pass. The Lux Ferrum was going down. It fell back to Morningstar with infinite grace, but Forix knew that something of such titanic mass would cause untold devastation upon impact. He turned from the slowly falling starship, seeing 100 or more red-armored soldiers advancing on his captured Hydra. Many were armed with weapons easily capable of taking out his newly acquired tank. Not that it mattered now. He swung the turret around, lowering the quad-mounted autocannons as far as they could go. "Iron within, iron without," he said. Chapter 7. Even in Death. Matters Theosophical. A god falls. Returning to flesh was never easy. Like a slave freed of its fetters and then forced back into servitude by a trusted friend, the spirit felt betrayal as its cage of meat and bone enfolded it once more. Its vengeance was repercussive pain, a bone-deep ache and weariness that took longer to fade the farther and freer the soul had flown. Ahriman awoke in an acrid, chemical-rich fog. He blinked away after images of exploding fighter jets and reached up to run a hand over his face. His palm came away bloody. When had he removed his helmet? It lay beside him, scorched and torn by impacts. Where was he? A rush of sensory information came to him. Metal railings, the stench of blood, and the acrid reek of propellant gases, physaline and lapping powder. He heard thousands of screaming voices and a deep rumbling vibration that felt like the beginnings of a world-shattering earthquake. He was propped up against the crew barrier of a mobile artillery piece, a Hydra by the looks of it, its barrels bleeding heat and drooling smoke, its breech buckled and spewing fumes both toxic and flammable. Slumped before him was a figure he only recognized as Forix due to the configuration of his aura. The Iron Warrior's armor was all but gone, the ceramite plates fused with his flesh and running like wax across his body. His skin was roasted black with vapor flash and what looked like plasma burns or melter flare. His breathing was the ragged, embattled hikes of collapsing lungs. Forix lifted his head, and Ahriman saw one eye was a fused milky white of burn tissue. The other swam with incomprehension before recognition set in.
"Ahriman,"
wheezed Forix.
"Apologies. I swore no harm would come to you while I watched over you."
Ahriman pushed himself to his feet and swept his gaze around him. The Hydra was a steel island amid a sea of corpses. At least 200 bodies surrounded it, each one clad in the red livery of Morningstar. He read the scene in an instant, knowing Foryx had killed them all in defence of him and this solitary bastion. "You kept me alive, my friend," said Ahriman, kneeling by Foryx and placing a palm on his ruined chest. The Iron Warrior flinched, his every nerve on fire. Ahriman reached deep inside himself and used his Pavoni arts to blunt Foryx's pain. It was the least he could do to ease the man's passage into death. Foryx shook his head and clamped a fused fist around Ahriman's gauntlet. He said, "A legionary of the Fourth never turns from pain." "Not even in death?" "Especially not then," said Foryx, tilting his head to look into the sky. "Anyway, you would be wasting your powers." Ahriman looked up, just as the drifting clouds of propellant parted, pushed aside by clashing gravitic waves to reveal the blasted underside of the Lux Ferrum. A drizzle of torn metal fell from the mass conveyor's belly as it sank back to the ground. A sick sense of inevitability settled in Ahriman's gut. "This is what I saw," he said. "This is how it ends." "In fire and blood," said Foryx. "As it should be, for warriors like us." In a matter of minutes, Kalena would be obliterated. Perturabo and his senior officers stood upon the highest bastion of the Sharai Maveth, watching helplessly as the Lux Ferrum fell from the sky. Perturabo gripped the edge of the parapet with force enough to crumble its stonework. They had watched in horror as anti-aircraft ordnance had raked the belly of the mass conveyor and raged impotently as an entire squadron of thunderbolts blasted the gravitic tugs from the sky. Those same fighters had, one by one, destroyed themselves in an inexplicable paroxysm of self-immolation. His warriors had speculated on a schism within the traitors' ranks, but Perturabo alone had seen the faintest nimbus of something incorporeal streaking between the fighters before each explosion. There could be only one explanation. "That is the work of the 1,000 Suns," he whispered. "My lord," said Barban Falk, "the 15th caused this?" "No," said Perturabo. "They are trying to stop it." "What is about to happen is beyond anyone's power to stop." Perturabo did not reply, knowing that Falk was entirely correct. Thousands of refugees were fleeing in panic through Kalena's streets. Others stood in enraptured horror, staring up at their doom as it fell from the sky. But stand or run, none of them would survive the mass conveyor's impact. The faint sound of terrified screams was carried on the winds blowing in off the ocean. The Lux Ferrum shuddered like a wounded beast as its captain fought a futile battle to keep it aloft. Glittering debris rained from its wounded flanks. "Come on!" urged Harcourt, staring at the ship and slamming a fist on the parapet. "Fight, damn you! Keep her in the air!" Barban Falk shook his head. "An impossible task, Harcourt. When that ship hits, everyone in the city is going to die. The sons of Shaitan have been thorough in their betrayal." "Faithless cowards!" said Harcourt. "Their treachery has condemned tens of thousands." Hot anger surged through Perturabo at Harcourt's words, a primal fury that roared with the need to hit back at those responsible for this atrocity. "That is the least of their sins," said Perturabo. "They have broken their oath of loyalty to the Emperor. That oath is an inviolable covenant, one that can never be reforged once broken. For such betrayers, there can be no forgiveness, only the most painful of deaths." Perturabo looked away from the doomed starship, feeling himself inexorably drawn to look up at the malignant sky. Vivid magnastorms burned in the upper atmosphere, hurling spears of lightning to the planet's surface and painting the line of the horizon with electric fire. Even through the nightmarish storms, Perturabo, and Perturabo alone, could still see the distant star maelstrom, its unnatural energies swirling like a whirlpool in a stagnant ocean. It stared down at him like the eye of a patient hunter, as it had since he had first seen it clinging to the rain-soaked cliffs of Logos. Were its energies brighter around Morning Star? He tore his gaze from the heavens, his mind racing to calculate the likely force and radius of the Lux Ferrum's impact. Kalena would be destroyed, that much was certain. The Sharai Maveth would suffer severe damage, yes, but it would endure. He briefly considered opening the gates to those civilians near enough to reach them, but almost immediately rejected the notion. How could he be certain he would not be admitting the same traitors who had brought down the Lux Ferrum? With a heavy heart, Perturabo knew only one logical course of action was open to him. "Pull every warrior within the Sharai Maveth," he said. "We batten down the hatches. I want every gate sealed, every portal locked, and every blast shield engaged, and power up the void generators. I think we're going to need them." He turned away from the coming catastrophe. The evacuation was in ruins, but Perturabo's mind now turned to ways it might yet be salvaged. If Majos Tankorix's calculations were correct, time remained to construct temporary landing fields on the plains around Zarukin. They were wide enough to bring transatmospheric troop ships down from the orbiting fleets. It would be a fraction of how many they could have saved, but— "Throne!" yelled Barban Falk, pointing at something over the parapet. "Coming in from the south! What is he thinking?" Perturabo snapped from his calculations and looked to where Falk had indicated. He saw a lightning-struck Stormbird arcing in over the coastline. Its engines were on fire, and it was heading straight to the heart of the landing platforms, as if seeking to join the vast bulk of the Lux Ferrum in death. The Stormbird's hull rippled along its length with burning fuel, and it shuddered as it passed through the tortured magnetic fields surrounding the Lux Ferrum. He knew instantly who was on board. "What is that pilot doing?" asked Harcourt. "Is he insane?" "Perhaps," said Perturabo. "It's Magnus." Curiously, Ahriman felt little fear as the vastness of the Lux Ferrum closed in, a crushing sky falling to end him and everyone in Kalena. He eased his mind into the third enumeration, finding solace in the clarity it brought. If this is death, then it's not so terrible. He looked over at Forix, his flesh burned to the bone, and reconsidered that thought. Blood pulsed from the Iron Warrior's many wounds, grievous hurts even transhuman biology could not undo. Despite Forix's wishes, Ahriman turned his power upon him. He subtly closed the pain gates in the Iron Warrior's spine, hearing a groan of relief escape his scorched lips. "This is what you saw?" asked Forix. Ahriman nodded. "Yes." "And do such visions always come to pass?" "Most of the time." "Only most?" "Sometimes, by knowing the future, you can change it." "The implication being that you never actually saw the future. Merely a potential future, yes?" Ahriman smiled. "I underestimated you, Forix." "Most people do. But am I correct?" "I cannot give you a definitive answer, my friend," said Ahriman. "We hold conclaves within the fellowships that seek to answer such questions, but none have yet found a satisfactory answer." "I have one," said Forix. "You can answer a riddle that has confounded the greatest thinkers of the Thousand Suns?" "There's that arrogance again." "Apologies." Forix shook his head. "We have only a few moments left to live. Don't waste them asking for forgiveness." "Then tell me your answer, so I do not die in ignorance." "Very well," said Forix. "These visions you have, you see them, and you act to thwart them, or see them come to fruition?" "Yes." "If everything you see is merely a potential future, then the very act of seeing it changes the outcome in one of two ways. First, if your vision is of, say, my death, and it still comes to pass, no matter whether you let it happen or resisted it, then the future was set and nothing you could have done would have made any difference. Or, if by acting you change it so I live, then was it truly a vision of the future? By seeing me die, did you change the future because you were then compelled to save me? So my question is this. Are you changing the future by seeing it? Or are potential futures changing you?
Ahriman nodded, pleased at Forrex's insight. Basic, though it was. Did he truly believe the brightest minds of the Thousand Suns had not already debated this thought experiment 100 times over? Oh, you pick a strange time for a discussion on matters theosophical, my friend, said Ahriman.
I don't often get the chance among the Fourth, said Forrex. The dodecatheon is a place of hard realities, not matters intangible.
The dodecatheon?
One of our masons' lodges within the Legion, said Forrex. A meeting place for builders and strategists to come together and test which of the newest theories of fortifications are in ascendance.
Forrex looked up, and Ahriman saw the acceptance of death in his one remaining eye. Perhaps there was something to the myths of old Earth, of surrendering an eye in return for wisdom after all. I wish I had more time to know you, Forrex, said Ahriman, to learn of your legion and its ways. I suspect there is a great deal we could teach one another.
If only we had more time, said Forrex. But that is the one resource we can never recoup.
In the great ocean all things are possible, said Ahriman, holding out his hand. Forrex took his wrist in the warrior's grip. And a roaring tide of power surged through Ahriman. The scarab on his armor's chestplate blazed with light, and he felt a connection between him and every single warrior of the Thousand Suns. A red veil fell over Ahriman's eyes, and he saw Forrex relentlessly marching across a bloody battlefield, the bones of millions ground to ash beneath his boots. The Iron Warrior was wreathed in the corrosion and dust of an unending war fought in the darkness of a far future, engulfed in storms of iron and fire, wading through blood and death with burning banners raised all around him. This Forrex was a monster.
You live,
breathed Ahriman, his limbs swelling with power, the likes of which he never imagined he might feel.
You will not die on Morning Star.
The vision of Forrex as a dark god beneath a black sun returned to him, and he lowered his gaze towards the wounded Iron Warrior. But you must. Ahriman raised his arm, ready to kill Forrex where he lay, but cried out as yet more agonies suffused his limbs. This was dangerous, lethal power, the kind each flight in the great ocean promised in its hollow blandishments, but which every initiate was warned never to touch. It pulled him to his feet as if he were a puppet moved by the will of a cruel master. Fire blazed in his eyes as all his arts, in all their most potent forms, erupted from his flesh. Raptora energies warped the metal of the Hydra like softened wax. Athenaean insight revealed every banal secret within Forrex's single-minded skull. The Iron Warrior howled in pain as Ahriman's Pavoni arts restored life to his flesh, remaking shattered bones, regenerating scraps of organs, and slathering fresh-grown skin over previously scorched meat. Corvidae prescience showed him Morning Star shattered, its core sundered, its air stripped away, and the void echoing to the disbelieving screams of its people. His neck snapped around as he felt the approach of something incredible, something brighter than 1,000 stars, a psychic fire that could burn the entire world, then work miracles with its ashes. It came in like the phoenix of legend, a stormbird, its hull burning from prow to stern, and standing upon its frontal assault ramp was a messianic figure of red fire, a Cyclopean titan of unimaginable power and infinite majesty.
"Father," said Ahriman.
The dying steel leviathan filled the sky, its impossible length stretching to the horizon, a hammer of the gods come to smite the earth and bring about its ruination.
Burning metal and screaming flesh fell from ruptured compartments. Men and women leapt to their deaths rather than be consumed by the fires raging within the starship's belly. The power filling Magnus, the seismic force dragged from the heart of the planet, still raged within his breast. Any thoughts of ritual dissipation, of a gradual psychic decompression, were moot, for now he had the perfect release. Phosis Takar stood beside Magnus on the burning Stormbird's assault ramp, his aura ablaze with exhilaration and fear. Will this work, or has my arrogance sealed our fate?
Can you really do this, my lord?
Asked Phosis Takar, echoing the Primarch's thought. I truly don't know, said Magnus, moving through every one of the enumerations to prepare for the impossible feat he was about to attempt. But nor can I simply leave the tens of thousands of people aboard the Lux Ferrum and in Kalena to their doom. Phosis Takar nodded, the decision made.
Then what can I do?
You are already doing it. The scarab upon Phosis Takar's chest had been hewn from the crystalline walls of the reflecting caves below Tizka, and now served as a conduit between him and his gene-sire. Through these psychically resonant gemstones, Magnus could touch the soul of every one of his sons. He felt as they felt, shouldering their every emotion. He took on their indignant rage at what was being lost on Morningstar, and shared their unquenchable thirst for new knowledge. But most of all, he shared their deep longing to reveal their true selves. Their powers were as much a part of them as breathing, and to keep that hidden from their brother legions was to keep a part of their soul in chains. From one son, Magnus felt the barely acknowledged fear that his Primarch was leading them down into a darkness from which there could be no return. He knew who that was, of course. Magnus had known since their first meeting on Prospero, when he had tried to hide the agony he was suffering, that the future would set them on altogether different paths. This intimate connection between Magnus and his sons allowed no secrets to be kept, no truths to be unacknowledged, or desires hidden away. The power was intoxicating. To know everything. Who would not wish such a boon? Their power and love flowed to him, augmented him, 1,000 conduits to the great ocean. He took that energy and shaped it, wielding more power than any had before him. Had the Emperor ever dared so greatly? Perhaps, but he rarely spoke of the full extent of his reach. Would Magnus be the first of the Primarchs to eclipse their father's deeds? Magnus tried to dismiss the thought as fleeting arrogance, but a thorn of it remained lodged in his heart. And who would blame him? What son did not aspire to be more than his father? The Stormbird slammed down, skidding in an arcing loop across the platform. Prometheans sprayed like rain from its ruptured tanks, instantly igniting in the flames burning along its wings. The gunship bounced back into the air, before slamming down onto its belly and breaking its back. The landing gear shattered instantly, sheared away by the force of the impact. Orange sparks flared from grinding, shrieking metal. The Stormbird howled in pain as it finally ground to a halt, billowing smoke and flames. Magnus leapt from the downed gunship, and his warriors followed him without question. Their power flowed into him, honed and distilled by the scarab gems upon their breastplates. The belly of the Lux Ferrum was 100 meters above them. 90. 80. Clashing electromagnetics from damaged repulsors churned the air. Coolant discharge vented from its colossal drive cores. Hurricane winds scoured the platform in localized tornadoes and burning plasma vortices. Every step onwards became a battle. Magnus bent into the storm of gravitic waves and plasma fire, feeling his skin blister in the intolerable heat. His hair charred and crisped as his warriors formed the mandala around him, the paint bubbling and peeling on their warplate. 50 meters. Magnus looked up and thrust his arms to the sky with a word of change upon his lips. He unleashed the vast power roiling with him and let the world's wounded core pour through him. He channeled it, shaped it and bent it to his will. His sons added what little they could, their power infinitesimal next to the energies he sought to master. Magnus drew upon his deepest raptures, formulae he had only ever read of in the Emperor's most secret vaults. Unchecked energies wrought him into a being of purest energy, a titan at the end of the world, the great god Donar, wrestling the great world serpent in the last great battle. Blinding waves of etheric raptures poured from him in a thunderous bow wave, as his power met the descending force of the Lux Ferrum. Could his body endure what was being demanded of it? The underside of the vast starship crumpled as its weight pressed down on the psychic force pushing upwards. Colossal bulkheads designed to withstand the push and pull of void maneuvering and warp translation bent and split under stresses beyond their power to endure. Hull plates, thick enough to withstand explosive ordnance, peeled back like wet parchment. Hydraulic fluids drizzled and burned in the swirling flames. Magnus roared, his mind expanding in a lattice of geometric progression. Every breath was fire in his lungs. He was driven down to his knees, arms upraised like the great Titan condemned to bear the weight of the cosmos upon his shoulders in penance for his rebellion. The Lux Ferrum continued its descent, a falling sky of burning metal. Its dark shadow engulfed them all. 30 meters. Magnus's mind buckled under the furious storm of ether raging within him. Gene-wrought flesh stretched drum-taut, every bone unseating from its neighbour as sinews stretched. His synaptic connections overloaded to burnout. Could anything fly so close to such power and live? Magnus reached deep for everything he had left, but he had nothing more to give, no reserves to draw upon. Then a solitary legionary limped from the firestorm, the gemstone upon his chest a too-bright beacon that spoke of their shared destiny.
"Harriman,"
said Magnus.
"help us! Help me!"
The legionary broke the circle of the mandala and stood before him. The great ocean swelled within him, stronger than any of his other sons. How had Magnus not seen this before? Ahriman placed his hand upon the Primarch's chest and threw his head back in agony as a measure of the power consuming his Primarch passed into a body wholly unable to bear such a burden. The power he passed to Magnus was fractional, a pebble in a field of boulders. But even a pebble could start an avalanche. Ether fire raged around them in a spinning conflagration, shrieking and blue like a murderous flock of azure raptors. Howling laughter surrounded them, a choir of voices that cackled with lunatic glee and wept with dour fatalism. Swirling discs of light spun like wind-blown petals, but the power they bore was fed into the combined magics of Magnus and his 1,000 sons.
"It is working!"
Magnus cried out into the minds of his sons, feeling the inexorable descent of the mass conveyor slowing. And, as the great alchemists of old Earth knew,
"As above, so below!"
The power wrought and expended from the surface of Morningstar was incredible, a weaving of immaterial energies a mere handful of beings had ever dared to wield before. And it was working. Magnus stood at the centre of a circle of power, channeling incomprehensible energies to achieve the impossible. His flesh was pellucid and incandescent, an angelic form to equal anything born of Baal. The mass of the Lux Ferrum could not be stopped, but it could be slowed just enough. The city-sized weight of the mass conveyor was barely 10 meters overhead. Magnus and his warriors, safe within the crater, pushed up into its belly as the rest of the vessel settled on the platform with a groan of metal that went on and on until it felt like it would never stop. But it did stop. The Lux Ferrum gently touched down on the platform it had only recently departed, kissing the ground with the tenderest touch. Its keel was broken, and its mighty heart was spent. It would never fly again, and Morningstar would be its grave. But the majority of those born within its hull were still alive. Magnus exhaled a breath of purest light and power, the last of the potent energies blazing from his fingertips and leaving him hollow and empty. The light from his body slowly faded, leaving only embers and sparks from the cracked hull overhead as their illumination. For now, they were cut off from the outside world. Enclosed within the dome, his force had pushed into the Lux Ferrum's hull.
"You did it, my lord,"
whispered Ahriman, his features gaunt and drained like a consumptive. Magnus nodded, too exhausted to speak. He did not trust his limbs to function, nor his mind to form a coherent answer. He heard a rhythmic hammering sound, like a forge master beating a blade into shape. It came over and over, like approaching thunder. Was he imagining it, or was he simply hearing his heart finally giving out under the strain?
"You did it, my lord,"
repeated Phocis Takar.
"But at what cost?"
replied Magnus, his gaze sweeping his immediate surroundings. His every breath was dry and metallic, his flesh searingly hot to the touch. 24 of his warriors lay dead around him, their bodies little more than empty suits of armour, filled with the ashen remains of their flesh. Fine grey dust poured from their sundered plate and molten flex joints. Only Ahriman and Phocis Takar had survived the psychic storm.
"They are all dust," said Magnus. "Every one of them."
A great and terrible guilt swept through Magnus as the hammering sounded again, louder this time, more insistent.
"What have I done?"
he said, as the last of his strength drained from his body and light flooded the cavern beneath the Lux Ferrum. Magnus saw movement in the light, a vast being of burnished steel and fury, a titan in iron and yellow and black. He knew him, but could not name him. He fell, but did not hit the ground.
"I have you, brother," said Perturabo.
Evacuation crews debarked the refugees from the Lux Ferrum as swiftly as possible, leading thousands of weeping civilians back to the camps beyond the city walls. Upon these walls were battle companies of iron warriors, who now patrolled as if the city were an embattled outpost. Trust was in short supply, and all further launches from Morningstar were abandoned until a functioning air traffic control could be set up within the fortress of the Iron Warriors. It had been the worst day in Morningstar's history. Not even the few short but violent wars that ravaged it in the centuries since its founding had claimed such a toll. The earthquake in Attar had claimed over 15,000 lives, but the death toll would have been higher had it not been for the intervention of Legion forces. Magnus and his warriors had rescued over 2,000 souls from the ruins, and the Stor Bezashk Corps of the Iron Warriors cleared roads, erected bridges over newly torn fissures, and organized the flow of refugees from the destroyed city with an efficiency that had been sadly absent from the governor's staff. Yet even amid such terrible suffering and loss of life, there were a few spots of light amid the darkness. Mechanicum Cybernetica cohorts followed a transponder signal to recover Majos Tankerix, who marched unharmed from the shattered hills around Attar, bearing the wounded body of Major Anton Orlov across his shoulders. Conrad Varga's unconscious body was borne from the wrecked Stormbird by Iron Warriors apothecaries and taken to the Medicae facilities within the Sharai Maveth. Rescue crews found the hideously burned bodies of Vashti Eshkol and Majos Tezarom in the rubble of Kalena's orbital command center. Incredibly, they had survived the blast, and were even now being treated with life-saving technologies. Perturabo himself carried Magnus within his fortress. His sons stationed in Kalena rallied to him, but he did not stir. Every one of them had been joined with him at the moment of his fall. They had all felt his pain and caught a momentary glimpse into the mind of a god. Whether that knowledge would shape them for good or ill remained to be seen. Category 10. Annihilation. Massive scale and duration. Planetary event. Chapter 8. Mistakes. A legendary name. Make them pay. Magnus drifted on tides unknown. An infinite white void surrounded him, without dimensions or points of reference. He did not know this place, but it was clearly not the great ocean. Perhaps this was what it was like to die. Or was this what a mind experienced when it finally let slip the moorings of existence and gave in to death? No. Neither of those answers seemed satisfactory. For all that he had no experience of dying, this did not feel like the end of his body of light. He had no sensation of his flesh, no sight of the absurdly fragile silver thread that linked his power to his corporeal shell when soaring in the great ocean. Perhaps he had reached too far, dared too greatly, and this was the price he must pay. His body lived, but it was no longer linked to his mind. He had seen aspirants fail in this way before, and watched as their bodies wasted away without the spirit to sustain them. Would that be his fate? Would his sons be forced to watch their sire fade, the skin pulling back on his skull, the flesh melting from his bones? Or would his miraculous gene-forged body endure forever, leaving him trapped in this limbo state? Who could know? The great dramaturg had only scratched the surface of things when he called death the undiscovered country, from whose bourne no traveller returns. If this was his fate, then Magnus would have no regrets. Better to have flown too close to the sun than never feel its heat. "I am still alive," he said, and his voice was thrown back at him as though he stood in the centre of a great amphitheatre. Since no vistas were presenting themselves in this void, Magnus would conjure his own. If he was going to spend an eternity in this place, then he would be damned if he'd do it bored. Memories surged around him, a series of snapshots from his life. The climb into the hills of Prospero, where he found the statue whose destruction gave rise to the fellowships of the Thousand Suns. The inaugural conclave of the first masters in the reflecting cave, taking a knee before his father upon their first meeting in Oculum Square, though in truth they had spoken for many years already. He conjured them at random, knowing all the while that nothing was ever truly random, wondering which memory would come to the fore. The answer presented itself, as the night he had climbed the Astartes tower to meet his father on the eve of his departure from Terra swam into focus. It had been a bittersweet moment, for they were both aware it would be many years before they met this way again. The Great Crusade was a vision of supreme ambition, one that would take father and sons to the uttermost corners of the galaxy for decades, perhaps even centuries. Only a fool would entertain any notions of certainty on the commencement of such a singular undertaking. They had sat upon the highest peak of the slender tower, and cast their minds out over the world, flying together one last time. Only then did Magnus understand he was not simply witnessing a memory, but was part of it. Their bodies of light threaded the deep canyons of the mid-Atlantic ridge, then circled the arid dust basin of the Mediterranean before following the Urals from Kara Oceanica to the Kievan Rus Khaganate. They circled Mount Narodnya, watching the ghosts of Fulgrim and Ferrus Manus as they competed over the labour of twin weapons. "So perfect," said the Emperor. "Which one?" asked Magnus, but his father just smiled. Magnus watched his brothers striving to outdo one another, finding their need to prove their superiority faintly ridiculous. What did it matter who could forge the best weapon, when a Primarch was a weapon unto himself? "You are so like me in so many ways," said the Emperor. Magnus flushed with pride, but as always the Emperor's words carried multiple meanings. "You have a great many of my strengths, but strength magnified to excess eventually becomes a weakness." "How can that be?" "Confidence can spill over into arrogance," said the Emperor. An obsessive pursuit of perfection can blind you to what it costs to achieve. Attention to detail can become micromanagement. Magnus, you have my intellect and my power, but like me, you are prone to believing you can do no wrong, that your intellect lifts you above the risk of making petty mistakes or errors based on emotion. What mistakes have I made? Asked Magnus, dreading the answer. Only time will tell what is a mistake and what is not. But an inability to believe you can ever make a mistake is dangerous. It leaves a mind open to certainty, and unwavering certainty is our greatest enemy. Always question, and always be open to different ways of thinking, other ways of untangling the knot. That is the gift I give to you on this eve of our crusade. I do not understand. You will, my son, said the Emperor. Despite all I have just said, you are different enough from me that I can see how you will succeed where I have failed. Failed? How have you failed? I do not know yet, said the Emperor, with a wistful sheen to his subtle body. But I will soon, and I sense you and your favored son must play a part in rectifying my mistakes. My favored son? Asked Magnus. They are all my sons. There's truth in that, yes. But there is one who will bear your ambitions when you need them to travel farther than you could ever dream. Where in this galaxy can I not travel? Said Magnus. He felt his father's amusement. There are always places a son will travel where his father should not, replied the Emperor. Just when you believe there is nothing more to be done, one of your sons will show you how wrong you have been all this time. Well, this sounds like gloomy advice, Father, said Magnus. I had hoped for something a little more inspiring as we venture out into the unknown. What could be more inspiring than to know you have taught your sons to reach greater heights than you? They are your immortality, Magnus. No more had been said on the matter, and they had returned to their bodies atop the Astartes tower to say farewell. His father had taken a seat by the great celestial oculum, and the impossibly complex maps detailing his plans for galactic conquest. Though they had shared a sublime moment flying the ether, Magnus knew his time here was at an end. The Emperor turned and extended his hand, and Magnus looked into his father's eyes, wondering how he had not noticed the wistful look of sadness he now saw in them. Remember this moment, said the Emperor. I will, promised Magnus. He took his father's hand, and Magnus gasped in sudden pain as his spirit was wrenched from the memory and hurled back into his body. Magnus opened his eye. Harsh lumen strips and hissing pipes hung from a ceiling of bare and brutal girders. The grim functionality of his surroundings sought to push the warm memory of his father from his mind. Magnus knew better than to suppose his consciousness had fashioned that particular memory purely by chance. What mistakes have I made on Morningstar? Every atom in his body was bathed in fire. Together with Ahriman and Phosas Takar, Magnus marched through the arched, fresco-lined passageways of the Shirai Maveth. Iron warriors flanked each intersection like knights of old, and acid-etched blast doors lifted at every choke point. The interior of the Iron Warriors' fortress was a beautiful death trap, a series of cunning blind alleys, bottlenecks, and crossfires that would make any assault suicidal. Repercussive pain filled his bones with barbed wire, his veins with acid. He had known that such magnificent power could not be wielded without consequence, but this pain was beyond even his powers to ease. "Oh, perhaps you should have remained on the Medicae level, my lord," said Ahriman. "I am grateful for your concern, Azek," said Magnus, "but I can tolerate this. I do not pretend to know how deep your pain runs, my lord, but the Pavoni were fussing over you like a newborn." The image amused Magnus, and he smiled, though even it sent a current of agony through the muscles of his face. "How did I get here?" "The Lord of Iron carried you," said Phocis to Carr. "He would not permit us to bear you." Magnus heard the strain in Phocis to Carr's voice, and felt his son's anger that someone, even a Primarch, not of the 15th Legion, had borne his wounded lord. "And how long have I been absent?" "A day and a night," answered Araman. "What have I missed?" "Morning Star is rushing to embrace its own extinction," said Phocis to Carr. "The last 30 hours have seen a sharp rise in attacks by the Sons of Shaitan, bombings, spree killings, and random acts of individual psychosis. We're seeing a wave of mass suicides in the refugee camps and escalating incidences of familial violence resulting in bloodshed." "The Lux Ferrum?" asked Magnus. "Fully evacuated," said Araman. "But there is something else you should know." "What?" "Athava and the warriors you sent to Zarukin have not returned. We cannot raise them on the Vox or contact them via psychic means." Magnus paused to consider Araman's news, taking a moment to allow a sudden nausea to pass. Clearly his sense of secrets buried in Zarukin had been correct. But what danger had he sent his sons into? "I will find them," Magnus promised, letting out a hot breath. "We do not leave any of our brothers behind." The pain racking his mind and body was intense. His spine felt as if every vertebra was being inexorably crushed in a forge vice, and his thoughts moved like glue through his mind. He would be suffering this pain for weeks to come. "Where does this increase in attacks put us in terms of getting the rest of Morningstar evacuated?" He felt Araman and Phocis to Carr's reluctance to answer. "Better the Lord of Iron tells you," said Araman. The heart of the Sharai Maveth had changed a great deal since Magnus had last seen it. Perturabo's sanctum still had the air of a workshop, but one with a series of impossible deadlines to meet. The vaulted space was now filled with new additions, hardwired cogitator banks drawing power from freshly installed battery racks, scores of Lex mechanics, and 100 or more calculus logi, passing linguascript at the speed of thought between adepts seconded from the Analyticae. Majos Tankerix held court over the new arrivals, and directed his mechanicum staff with vigour as they attempted to untangle the chaos that threatened to overwhelm the evacuation effort. Perturabo and a dozen of his warriors watched from his elevated workshop, and Magnus winced as he climbed the steps to meet his brother. Perturabo looked up as he approached, and his stoic expression lifted at the sight of Magnus. He stepped away from the warriors gathered around the table and shook his head. "I have long held that it would take something immense to kill one of us," said Perturabo. "But I had no idea you would take that as a challenge." Magnus shrugged, masking the pain shooting down his spine. "I had to do something," said Magnus. "I could not stand by and let so many die. You would have done the same?" "Modesty doesn't suit you," said Perturabo with a grin. "I know I am strong, but even I would struggle to bear the weight of a starship." "It was not physical strength that saved the Lux Ferrum." "I know. But it does not matter how you saved that ship, only that you did. Tales of your heroism will travel far from Morningstar. The great Primarch Magnus, who bore the weight of a vast starship upon his noble shoulders. This is how legends are born, brother." Magnus had not considered the idea of his act becoming widely known, but with troublesome rumours already circulating the crusading expeditionary fleets, perhaps a story to reinforce the positive aspects of the Thousand Sons' abilities would be no bad thing. Perturabo nodded towards the view-screen, calling up images of the many thousands of people beyond the city walls still awaiting rescue. "Have your legionaries told you what the people of Morningstar are calling you now?" asked Perturabo. "At least the ones who aren't killing themselves in droves." "No. What?" "They call you the Crimson King. Has a nice ring to it, don't you think?" "That it does," agreed Magnus. Perturabo placed one hand on his shoulder, the other at his neck, pulling him close for a fraternal embrace. His next words were for Magnus alone.
"You came a heartbeat from death," he whispered. "By all rights you should have died, and our father's great crusade would have been robbed of one of its brightest suns, brighter even than dear Horus. More importantly, I would have lost a dear brother. There are none among our kin I regard as highly as you. So promise me, you won't risk your life like that again."
Magnus shrugged and said, "We are warriors, Perturabo. Who among us can make such a promise?" Perturabo released him and turned back to the screen. "Heroic as it was, we are now faced with the burdensome task of recalculating the tally on who yet remains to be evacuated from Morningstar." "Are you saying I shouldn't have saved the Lux Ferrum?" "Not at all. We came here to save lives." "Then I do not understand." Perturabo called up a view of Kalena's port facilities. The Lux Ferrum lay shattered across the landing platforms, its keel split and gaping wounds in the hull exposing the vessel's iron guts. Mechanicum breaker units under the direction of the wounded Tezerom swarmed the ship, cutting it apart like oceanic hunters harvesting a slaughtered leviathan. "You saved the ship, but its wreckage now blocks fully a third of Kalena's platforms," said Perturabo. "Mistress Eshkol informs me it will take at least 4 days to render them usable again, and even with the newly constructed landing facilities beyond the city walls, my best estimate predicts only a third of those who boarded the mass conveyor will escape." Magnus was appalled. "So even though I saved the Lux Ferrum, most of the people it carried will still die?" "Regrettably so. We have not the ship assets, nor, as it turns out, the time to save them." "But we had months before Morningstar became unstable." "We did. Now we do not." "Were your calculations in error?" A flash of irritation crossed Perturabo's face. "They were not. Something fundamental has changed." "How is that possible?" "I do not know. See for yourself." The Primarch of the Iron Warriors swept away the image of the Lux Ferrum's hulk and replaced it with a wavering hololithic image of Morningstar. Innumerable cyclone-like storms swirled over the sphere's volume, growing and multiplying with terrifying speed and ferocity. Their motion was unpredictable, each changing direction at random, joining with others or breaking apart into hyper-violent local tempests. "These are Morningstar's geomagnetic field patterns," said Perturabo, rotating the globe with deft swipes of his palm. Magnus studied the pattern shifting over the globe. The motion of the undulating storm fronts and magnetic dissonance put him in mind of a deep and turbulent ocean. The normal flow of energy around the planet was hideously disrupted, and patterns that ought to be regular and unidirectional were jagged and inconstant. And yet Magnus stepped closer to the command table, shifting the lambent globe and drinking in the information. He let the ebb and flow of the magna storms wash over him. "I see something," he said, trying not to let the elusive thought slip away. "Something in the depths of the flow. Something unnatural." Magnus shifted his mind into the fourth enumeration, the realm of abstraction, coaxing revelation instead of forcing it into the light. Something in the evolution of the growth patterns shared by the storms felt awry, as though it were governed by an equation so complex, so fractal, it was all but invisible. "This is not random," he said, now seeing the beauty underpinning it all. "The patterns move like music or deep ocean currents, but they are not the result of natural interactions. The source of these storms is man-made." "Man-made?" said Perturabo. "Someone did this deliberately?" Magnus nodded, seeing more of the pattern emerge as the grammar of the storms coalesced in his mind. "If Majos Tankerix can develop an inverse algorithm capable of breaking down the mathematics of these flows—" "We can find the source," finished Perturabo. Wind-driven rain fell in torrential sheets over the platforms atop the Shirai Maveth, lashing the hulls of the two stormbirds, one gunmetal grey, the other vivid crimson. Lingering propellant fumes choking the upper atmosphere made the rain pitch black and mildly acidic. Portions of the gunship's hulls were streaked where the paint was thinnest. "It looks like Morningstar is stripping them of their identity," said Araman. "But no such damage is accruing to your warplate, brother," said Phocis Takar, cupping his hands and letting them fill with dark rain that looked like oil. Araman looked down at his armour and saw that Phocis Takar was right. Even in the gloom of the oncoming storm and the flickering lightning, the hue of his plate was still vividly crimson. "I will try to take that as a positive sign," he said, trying not to read anything into this peculiarity. "You should," advised Phocis Takar. "You have become too glum of late, Azek. We are almost done with this place, and soon we will be back on the crusade, doing the Emperor's work." Phocis Takar stood and let the rain fall from his palms. He rubbed his gauntlets together as if washing his hands. Araman turned his head to the sky and the coruscating atmosphere. A planet-wide lightning storm was brewing, the sky blazing in all directions, as if a distant conflagration was slowly closing on the city like a noose. Araman knew that wasn't literally true, but as a metaphor it was perfectly apt. "This is how a planet ought to meet its end," said Phocis Takar, "fighting to the last and raging at its extinction." "I've had my fill of worlds ending," said Araman. "We embarked on this endeavour to save the Emperor's realm, not to watch it die." "Not every world can be saved," said Phocis Takar. "Maybe not every world deserves to be saved." Araman rounded on Phocis Takar. "What do you mean by that?" The Raptora adept shrugged. "This planet's roots are weak. The Imperium should not be built on worlds whose foundations are crumbling." "And who would make that decision?" asked Araman. "You?" "Why not? Are we not the foremost legion in intellect? Do we not divine the future? If we cannot know better than any other which worlds will provide good footings for the Emperor's dominion, then who else can? Would you trust them?" Phocis Takar nodded in the direction of the Iron Warriors, giants with reflected bolts of lightning glittering upon their armour. Before Araman could answer, his mouth filled with the taste of blood and ash, of melting glass and steel. The recurring image of rain falling in endless sheets sent a jolt of horror through him, a sense of foreboding so strong it all but overwhelmed him. Perturabo conferred with his tech marines as his warriors boarded their stormbird, and Araman's gaze was drawn inexorably to Forix, a warrior who had been as good as dead and ready for interment in a dreadnought sarcophagus until Araman's unchecked power had healed him. The only sign of the warrior's near death was a slight limp, but Araman saw a dark halo wreathing him, an effect that ancient shamans had known and feared as a death mark. Could any of his brothers see it? Or was this merely an echo of the vision he had seen of the monstrous destiny ahead of Forix? He turned away, the sight of the Iron Warrior stirring a bone-deep nausea within him. "Is something wrong?" asked Phocis Takar. "What?" "Your weapon." Araman looked down and saw he had his hand on the grip of his bolter. He eased his finger carefully from the trigger. "Apologies, brother," he said, wishing to make light of the lapse in weapon discipline. "Ever since the attack on the Lux Ferrum, my seer sight has me jumping at shadows." "Well, good. That's your survival instinct kicking in," replied Phocis Takar. "One of those shadows might be dangerous." Araman nodded, already well aware that Forix was something supremely dangerous, even if he could not yet understand how. He let out a breath and forced himself to look away. 15th Legion Tech Marines tended the hull of Magnus's gunship, prepping it for a flight into hostile atmospherics. They fitted deflection conductors, ceramite insulators, and ablative plates over sensitive components that could be burned out by a rogue electromagnetic burst. "We're ready," said Phocis Takar, standing taller and pushing out his chest as Magnus emerged from the belly of the Stormbird. The Primarch conferred briefly with his tech marines, then nodded and waved them aboard. The 1,000 Suns marched onto the gunship, 25 in all, and swiftly took their assigned seats along its up-armoured fuselage. Ahriman and Phocis Takar were the last aboard, and were standing on the embarkation ramp when Perturabo came over to speak to his brother.
"Good hunting, Magnus," said the Lord of Iron. "May you find your missing sons alive and unharmed."
Magnus nodded and said, "And may you find the source of Morningstar's pain, brother."
"I will,"
said Perturabo. His gravel-voiced certainty left Ahriman in no doubt he would.
"And then I will destroy it."
"Even if you do, there is no saving this world."
"I know,"
said Perturabo, offering his brother his hand.
"It will be an act of vengeance, nothing more, but that will be enough for me."
"It will need to be enough for all of us," said Magnus, taking Perturabo's hand. As the Lord of Iron returned to his gunship, Ahriman saw a look of profound sadness in his Primarch's face. "My lord," he said, and the moment passed. "Is something wrong?" "Nothing," said Magnus, turning and striding down the troop compartment to take his place at the head of his warriors. What had Magnus seen when he gripped his brother's hand? Did he see every secret thought hidden? Would such knowledge be a blessing or a curse? Looking over at the Iron Warrior Stormbird, Ahriman knew exactly which it was. Vashti watched the Stormbirds lift off in a haze of jet wash and vaporized rain through the toughened glass of the makeshift control center. Mechanicum Adepts had built it on a cleared gun platform on the highest tower of the Shirai Maveth, and hurriedly wired it into the operating systems of the fortress. Barely functional was the expression that leapt to Vashti's mind when she first saw her new working environment. Together with Tezarom and a staff of calculus logi, she had resumed her duties coordinating airspace around Kalena after only 10 hours in the Medicae levels to treat her grievous wounds. An atomizer misted aerosolized water and counterseptic over her burned face. She tried to blink, then remembered she couldn't. The fire in the command center had vaporized the protective layers from her eyes, and until grafts and augmetics could be sourced, she relied on the atomizers. Her arms and back had been scorched black, but dropping behind her command console had saved her life from Carina Moreno's treacherous blast. A constant flow of stims kept the worst of the pain at bay, but even so, she hurt in a dozen places, and her every movement was cripplingly slow. Still, she had been inordinately lucky. Only she and Tezarom had made it out alive, if what Teza had become could be called living. The scraps of her friend's ruined body hung suspended, fetus-like, in an amniotic tank in the center of the makeshift control center. Cognitive enhancers hung like pulsing snakes from the rear of her cranium, boosting her ability to sift the cascades of data surrounding her in twitching fog banks of noospheric light. Princeps of the Collegia Titanicus sometimes commanded their giant war engines in a similar manner, and, it was said, the connection to the Omnissiah was sublime. Vashti could understand that, but the thought of her life spent as a wraith, preserved in biosuspension gel, made her skin crawl. Teza's body was broken beyond repair, but her mind was more agile than ever.
"Gunships will be safe distance clear in 6 seconds,
said Teza, her voice grating from the brass voxhorn hung from wires in the corner of the bare plascrete chamber.
"Operational timetable resuming in 10 seconds.
"Handoffs logged and ready," replied Vashti. "I have 54 ships making stacked figure of 8s overhead. Let's use the extra time they've given us." Vashti had suspended flight operations for 7 minutes to allow the legions a window to get their ships prepped and beyond Kalena's airspace. As it turned out, they'd only needed half that time. With the downing of the Lux Ferrum and the loss of the platforms for at least another 2 days, what transorbital ships they had were being pressed into making faster and more frequent trips between the fleet and the surface. Pushing ships and crews so hard was beyond dangerous, but what other choice was there? Vashti studied the crackling, static-washed panels before her. Kalena was all but abandoned. The people who'd thronged the city's streets now camped at the foot of the Shirei Maveth's walls. For a time, the sky over the fortress had remained clear and still, even as Kalena burned and localized magna tempests sent lightning ripping along its streets. Tens of thousands had pressed against the distant edges of the fortress's outworks, seeking safety in the lee of its towering walls. The Iron Warriors had been forced to deactivate the minefields and open the gates on the outer walls to allow Morning Star's people to approach. Now, an ocean of humanity pressed up against the fortress, stretching all the way back to the edges of the city, at least 100,000 or more, though with census information woefully out of date, it was impossible to know for certain.
"Focus, Mistress Eshkol,"
replied Tezza, all traces of the humanity she had once possessed in abundance now absent from her voice. Her friend's body endured, but what had made her human was all but gone. Vashti nodded and turned her attention from the thousands of people at the foot of the walls to the orbital tracks and streams of data being updated every second. In her last free second before Vashti took on the burden of getting as many people as she could off-world, she glanced down at the tracks of the two gunships as they slowly diverged. One raced north towards Zarukin, the other due west towards the center of Morning Star's last remaining ocean. "Find what you're looking for," said Vashti, angrier than she could ever remember. "Make the bastards pay for what they've done here."